Good morning. Please turn to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. We're going to start chapter 4 today, and before we do that, we'll give a brief recap of what we talked about last week. We worked through chapter 3. And in chapter 3, we talked about how Paul was worried about the Thessalonians. Right? He said that he'd heard that there was a lot of persecution going on there. They were relatively new Christians, at least from their maturity perspective. We kind of went back to how we started the whole study with the history of how the church got planted, and we remembered that Paul didn't get a lot of time to spend with them after he planted the church because he got run out of town pretty quickly. So Paul heard about the persecution, and he said he was worried that they might have given up or been compromised. And so in response to that, he said he sent Timothy to encourage them and also to check on their faith. Timothy came back with a good report, and he said not only was their faith intact, but he said they were living in love as well. And so Paul encouraged them to keep doing that, keep living in love, to let that overflowing, and he encouraged them to continue working towards holiness. That was chapter 3. And so now here in chapter 4, he's going to continue on with this topic of holiness, and we're going to work through verses 1 through 8 this morning. And in verses 1 through 8, he's going to be covering a particular aspect to holiness, kind of drilling down on that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's go ahead and we'll jump in, starting with verses 1 and 2. Again, we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. As for other matters, brothers and sisters, we instructed you how to live in order to please God, as in fact you are living. Now we ask you and urge you in the Lord Jesus to do this more and more, for you know what instructions we gave you by the authority of Lord Jesus. So Paul says he's given them instructions, and he says they've been following those instructions, and we talked a lot about that last week, didn't we? And then he urges them to keep heading down that path. And so verses 1 and 2 are pretty clear, very cut and dried from that perspective. But as we think through what Paul's writing about here, I think it's really important that we take a moment and recognize the historical context that surrounds this passage here. Right? Because Paul said he's talking about how to live in order to please God. He said, you know these instructions, you know what you're supposed to do, and now for the next 6 verses after that, he's going to talk about sexual purity. And so that's an extension of verses 1 and 2. So verses 1 and 2, here's biblical instructions for living. Verses 3 through 8, avoid sexual immorality. We're going to dive into that argument here in a minute, but again, I want to start out by just making note of the historical context in which this was written, because this idea of sexual purity would have been a foreign one to somebody living in Thessalonica some 2,000 years ago. We got to remember that as we read through this letter. Back then and there, the culture was different, right? There were just different standards back then. So in Thessalonica, about 2,000 years ago, mostly wives were expected to remain true to their husbands. They had to make sure that whatever heirs they produced were legitimate. So the expectation is wives would remain true to their husbands, but there were whole mainstream layers to the society that were promiscuous. And in many cases, infidelity was encouraged or actually considered virtuous. It was part of worship practices. It was part of a whole number of things that people generally agreed were good things. So with that in mind, right, what that culture was like, now we recognize we've got this group of people in the Thessalonian church who have been saved out of that lifestyle, and they're being asked to live very differently. And so these passages here about sexual purity might be something that we could easily take for granted. Those things were probably revolutionary, though, and confusing at the time to the original audience. And if you think about it, we can go a step further, too, and recognize we're living in this really weird spot in history right now where for most of us, we grew up being taught the virtue of purity. Right now, whether we followed that or not, that's a separate thing, but most of us grew up being taught that. But now we've got a whole new generation coming up, and they're being raised with an entirely different set of standards about what's considered acceptable and what's considered normal sexually. So we're entering a time here where these words from Paul are starting to sound foreign again. Later on, take a moment and kind of let that sink in. There is nothing new under the sun. What's old is new again, and we see one more example that the Bible is completely timeless. Right? The world keeps changing, but the Bible keeps proving itself again and again to be the exact message that the current generation needs. It's pretty amazing, right? So let's jump into the message here that Paul's trying to give. Starting at verse 3, he says, "It is God's will that you should be sanctified, that you should avoid sexual immorality." So Paul says, it's God's will that you should abstain from, and the Greek word here is porneia, and we translated in the NIV I read to you from, it's translated as sexual immorality. New American Standard also translated as sexual immorality. The King James translates this as fornication, and those things are both true, right? These are both good and accurate translations of the word. It can mean both of those things. But the reality is this Greek word is actually a bigger word than just either of these things. What porneia actually means is fornication and sexual immorality and prostitution and the like. It's a whole range of sexual sin. It is important for us to recognize because we keep saying here on Sunday mornings, we have to remember there is absolutely no gray area where it comes to spiritual matters. And this particular concept has been something that's become very popular lately to challenge. People try to parse this out and they try to nail down a very specific boundary. All right, and then the goal of that then would be that they could do everything that they want to up until they reach that boundary. Right, and so what some Christians try to do with this, and I'm not going to get real graphic here, but a lot of Christians today in the dating world try to say, well, this passage and others like it use the word fornication, and that's a very specific physical act, and so they'll say, well, that's the line, right? That's the line we don't cross, but then when dating, we won't do that, but other physical activities that are remarkably similar or serve the same process or serve the same purpose, those are okay, right? We'll go ahead and indulge in that. And what Paul is trying to say here, I think, is that this is not some very specific rule that he means to be a cutoff of some behavioral threshold here. You can do everything right up to this point and then we stop. I don't think that's what Paul's saying. This is a general concept, this word. It's a sweeping concept. It's saying we need to be living a life of purity and holiness. We need to be running as far as we can from this sin, not trying to get right up against some threshold where we're not technically sinning right now, but if we move one more inch in that direction, then it's sin. Right? Doing it that way, living life that way, that's not demonstrating love for God. That's not a pursuit of holiness. That's legalism. That's a Pharisaical approach to sinning. Sexual purity is not a matter of ritual cleanliness. It's an issue of the heart. Verse 4. He says, and let me read part of verse 3 again because it kind of continues. That you should avoid sexual immorality, verse 4, that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable. Now, verse 4 is pretty interesting because I don't know if you've done studying on your own on this passage, but this verse can be translated in a couple of different ways, and depending on how you translate it, you could wind up with some different meanings here. I read this to you this morning in the NIV, and I'll put it up on the screen here. In this translation, it says, each of you should learn to control your body in a way that is holy and honorable. All right, we'll come back to this translation here in a minute. But the King James and the New American Standard translate it a little bit differently. Here's the King James. Every one of you should know how to possess his vessel in sanctification and honor. And the trouble comes here with regards to two words here in this particular translation, possess and vessel. So this word possess in the King James, it can also be translated as it is control in the New International Version. It can be translated either way. Both of these are valid translations. But there's a third possible translation here. That word can also mean to acquire. And with regards to vessel, we're kind of used to, when we read the Bible, having vessel and body be synonymous. So that's usually not a problem for us when we translate it this way. But where we run into the problem here is if we translate the first word as acquire, and then we look at vessel, we can't acquire another vessel that is ourselves. Right? We can't do that. That doesn't work. And so some people have said then that 1 Thessalonians chapter 4:4 should be translated as, each of you should learn how to acquire a vessel for himself. And since that vessel can't be you, those folks will point to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7 that talks about the wife as being another vessel in the marriage relationship. And so going down that road, many scholars will say that the interpretation here really should be, each of you should learn how to acquire a wife for yourself. And since verse 4 is the development of verse 3, that would mean that Paul is saying choosing a wife is part of the process of sanctification. And I bring this up because you guys may have some study materials in your library at home that make this point, but I don't think this is the right interpretation here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but the short answer why this is wrong is pretty straightforward. Both translations actually work in a vacuum. Right? If you were to just kind of snip this part out of the Bible in the Greek, either of these translations would be valid, linguistically speaking. But when you consider the immediate literary and historical context, our NIV translation at the top really makes more sense. Because before and after this verse, Paul's talking about the whole church, and so it'd be kind of weird if he's talking to everybody and then he just kind of interjects some advice just to single men of a marriageable age and then immediately goes back to talking to everyone again. That wouldn't make a lot of sense, right? Historically speaking, this wouldn't work too well either because a lot of the marriages at that time and place were arranged. And so a good portion of Paul's audience, even men of marriageable age, wouldn't have had much say in who they were marrying anyway. So that couldn't be part of their sanctification process. And there's other reasons, but I think you guys get the point here. I just wanted to mention this because this is not a terribly uncommon interpretation, and I think it's flawed. This is not marriage advice for a small group of people. We don't want to miss what he's really saying here. I think in verse 4, Paul is giving general advice to everyone, saying, you've got to get control over what you're doing with your body. That's for all of us. And verse 5 gives us a contrast here. I'm going to read the last part of verse 4 again because it's just continuing. He says that each of you should learn to control your own body in a way that is holy and honorable, not in passionate lust like the pagans who do not know God. So Paul's saying, control your body, be holy, don't be like the world, and this leads into verse 6, and that in this matter no one should wrong or take advantage of a brother or sister. The Lord will punish all those who commit such sins as we told you and warned you before. And again, we have this difference of opinion here on how this should be translated. And I don't know for sure, but I think sometimes people might have just misread the King James because that translation says that no man go beyond and defraud his brother in any matter. And so you might read some study materials or a commentary or something that will say that verse 6 is a new point of discussion and it's talking about business dealings between believers. And so the thought process here would be verses 4 through 5, Paul saying, be holy in your sexuality, don't be like the pagans. And then in verse 6, in a similar way, be holy in your business dealings, don't be like the pagans. But again, that interpretation is kind of makes us accept this weird topic change in the middle of a discussion about sexual purity. So I think the better lesson to pull out of this here is that Paul's telling us a sexual relationship within the context of a biblical marriage is a God-honoring thing. An inappropriate sexual relationship with a brother or sister in the church, That's something done outside of the context of a biblical marriage that defrauds your brother or sister. It wrongs them. It's taking advantage of them. Paul says it's robbing them of their holiness. And that really fits in the context of everything else we've been working through this morning here. We have to learn to control our bodies, Paul says. Don't be like the pagans, Paul says. And Paul says, when you do fail at this, you're hurting other people too. You're taking them down with you. Don't do that. How many times have we heard argument today from the world arguing against abstinence? It says that intimacy is really just a harmless, consensual act between two adults. It doesn't hurt anybody. People should be able to do whatever they want to. Well, Paul tells us right here that's not true. Sex outside of marriage does hurt you. Sex outside of marriage hurts the person that you're doing that with, because this selfless act we can see from 1 Thessalonians 4, while it may be gratifying for the moment, it's an unholy thing to do. It's actually something that's separating you from God, right? We're supposed to be working to be more like Him. We're not trying to get farther away from Him. You don't want to do that to yourself. You don't want to do that to someone else. And verses 7 through 8 puts a nice bow on top of everywhere that we've been going with this. For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life. Therefore, anyone who rejects the instruction does not reject a human being, but God, the very God who gives you His Holy Spirit. Now, there's a whole lot that we could say about these two verses, but I'm going to whittle this down to just 2 points, and then we'll move on. The first is, Paul shows us or talks about a healthy view of holiness. So let's talk about holiness here. And this is something that used to make sense in our society, but in the past few generations, I think we've kind of lost the understanding of what this is, and we covered that kind of at the beginning of our discussion here. Paul says we're supposed to be holy, and so one of the ways that Christianity is attacked is an attack on the value of holiness. It's an attack on the attraction of holiness. Simply put, the world doesn't understand the point of holiness or why we should be doing this. We know that Satan is the great deceiver, and I think he's done an absolutely masterful job with this. One of the biggest charges against Christianity, aside from how dumb we all are believing in God and creation and all of that, one of the biggest attacks on Christianity is the lifestyle itself, and specifically holiness. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, stop committing all manner of sexual sin. You need to be holy. And so the world grabs a hold of this concept and kind of perverts it and says, see, Christianity, this pursuit of holiness, it's all about giving things up. It's all about taking away pleasure. It's prudish. It's all about making sure that you don't have fun. And look, I get it. I get the argument. Sin is fun, otherwise what would be the point, right? Nobody would be tempted by it. So the world tries to spin this biblical command for holiness into something that it's really not. And to kind of share a story with you here about this, back when I was working as a chaplain at the nursing home, I ran into this, and there was a woman there named Barbara Swan, one of the residents. I think her first name was Barbara, I'm pretty sure. I called a lot of the residents by their first names, but never her. She was this elegant, just beautiful woman, and despite the fact she was living in the wing of this facility where people who needed the most care lived, she had to be on oxygen a lot of the time. She was not well. I think she had cancer, everything. But I never saw her once when she wasn't just dressed to the nines. I mean, she was dressed impeccably, always had full makeup on, jewelry, everything. She always looked like she was ready for a dinner party. She always looked like she could just walk up to the front of the room and receive a humanitarian award. She spoke like people did back in black and white movies. And so there was this amazing regal lady in her 90s. And so how could you not call her Mrs. Swan? I mean, that's just, the name was perfect. So I would do these Bible studies there, and I would do worship services and other things too. But I found two kinds of people would show up to these activities. There were people in the facility who were devout Christians who were at the end of their lives, and so they were grasping on to any piece of God's word they could get a hold of because they were ready to meet Jesus. They were excited about it, right? So those people would show up to my studies and the worship services. But then there was this second type who came to my activities because they just didn't have anything else to do. So, I mean, seriously, it was a nursing home. There was bingo. They watched movies, but there wasn't a whole lot going on. And so some people were just painfully bored, and so they just come to a Bible study. And I thought that was absolutely wonderful because I got people in there who never would have otherwise studied their Bible. Mrs. Swan was one of these people who fell into the second category. She came to every single Bible study that I had. She came to every worship service that we held. And at least every other week, she would make the same comment. I'll be talking about some kind of instruction from the Lord, and she'd jump in and interrupt and say something like, "Why would anyone want to do this? They'd be so boring. Who would want to be around anybody like this?" Right? Same thing, like almost every week. And I really don't think she was trying to be rude. I think it just really didn't occur to her that there were real Christians in the room who were actually pursuing this as a lifestyle. Like, I don't think she meant to be calling me and others boring. I think she just couldn't wrap her head around this concept of holiness. Because to her, it was all about not doing the things that you want to do naturally. Look, I say this because I think Mrs. Swan is not the only one who thinks this way. That's how the world views our faith. They think it's all about the church and the Bible making sure that we don't have sex with other people. It's all about taking the fun out of life. But Paul shows us a different view of this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Yes, he says in the name of holiness, we need to abstain from porneia. We need to flee from sexual immorality, fornication, prostitution, and the like. But it's not because we're supposed to be constantly focused on a list of things not to do. In verse 7, Paul says, "For God did not call us to be impure, but to live a holy life." It's a call for positive action here. 1 Peter chapter 1:16 from our bulletin quotes Leviticus 11:44, "Be holy because I am holy." You see, there's no sin in God. So this concept of holiness, it's really not about not doing things. It's about us trying to be more like Him. Don't get me wrong, we've got to get rid of sin from our lives. That's a key part of holiness, but we shouldn't look at holiness as strictly a list of things we're supposed to avoid. Instead, we should look at it as a series of decision points and opportunities where we can make ourselves more like Jesus. The decision to be holy is a positive decision. It's not a negative decision. Choosing not to sin isn't all about giving something up. It's about taking on characteristics of God. Let me tell you, being like Jesus beats being sexually immoral every single time. It's not even a contest. Quick point of follow-up. Didn't want to leave her hanging. Mrs. Swan did eventually figure this out. All right, after about 6 months of sitting in Bible studies, making the same comment like week after week after week, even the same words, everything, she finally got it, right? And she finally gave her life to Christ in her mid-90s, and her whole countenance changed. Like literally overnight, you could see that she was a new creation. She smiled differently, she moved differently, and overnight, she changed and never once brought up the boring concern again, because she finally understood the point of holiness, and she pursued that for herself. Second point of application to get out of this from Paul regards where these ideas and where these instructions come from and what all that means. In verses 7 and 8 here, Paul gives us this monumental concept. He says that these ideas, these instructions are not Paul's ideas. He says they are God's ideas. And if you think about it, this concept that he just throws out there in just a few words, it's mind-blowing. That the implications that come out of that, we don't have enough time to go through them all, but I want to hit just a few. This is a great argument for the inspiration of the Bible right here. I mean, you've got academic professors and the brightest minds in the world argue back and forth on is the Bible really from God or is it from men? Look at the source, right? Paul right here is telling us this is not his idea. The author is telling us that this comes from God, right? We don't have to go farther to look for inspiration than that. Paul is telling us where he got his information from. Paul is also saying here the instructions that he's giving have divine authority. They come from God himself. Therefore, we need to do what he's saying. You don't get more authoritative than God telling us to do something. But there's another really, really important implication to what Paul's saying here that I want to bring out and talk about a little bit, and then we'll wind up here. And this absolutely flies in the face of what society is telling us about how faith and culture should interact here. Today, for a while now, the Bible has been under attack, right? It's always been under attack, but recently the form of attack that we've been seeing especially has been one where people are lining up the values of our culture alongside the values of the Bible, and where they're different, the world is challenging us to update our understanding of this book, right? They're saying that we have to change with the times. And the argument goes something like this, and I know you guys have all heard this. It says, Paul wrote these things 2,000 years ago. These rules were meant for that world, the 2,000-year-ago world, and society has changed a lot since then. So shouldn't the Bible adapt and change too? That's the rub, isn't it? Right? Almost all the conflict that happens between the world and Christianity comes down to this. And listen, if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, I think this seems like a reasonable request. Follow me on this. We are taught today that everything in life is what it is because it evolved to be that way. Right? Evolution gets applied to every single thing. We're taught that that is a foundational truth about reality. Everything evolves. And so, as we observe society evolving, why not assume that religion should also evolve to keep up? Right? Because how else can religion continue meeting the needs of the people? That's the worldly argument. And I got to say, if your presupposition is this is not a divine book and everything evolves and we are where we're at because of evolution, then I got to say that is a logical argument that is rhetorically and intellectually honest. And if 1 Thessalonians was nothing more than a 2,000-year-old letter from some guy named Paul, then that conclusion would probably be right. But 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 8 absolutely blows this concept out of the water. Paul says, these things that I'm writing you, they're not from me. They're from God. And since these instructions come from a holy and unchanging God, the argument that the Bible should chase an evolving society falls flat on its face. Right? We don't change the instructions from the Bible to match an evolving society because these instructions were never about society in the first place. Paul says the instructions are how we become more like God. So even though society is changing and evolving, God is not. Therefore, we need to hold fast and take the Bible at its word, even when our environment changes to make doing this problematic. Hope that's clear. It's an amazing thing that just jumps out at us from what Paul was saying here to the Thessalonians. So that's as far as we're going to go with this this morning. We're going to wrap up here with the study part.